The Great Escape from Alcatraz, Forbidden Rock. Close your eyes for a moment. Take a deep breath. Imagine yourself in the San Francisco Bay on a calm night where the starry sky reflects on the dark waves. The air is fresh, laden with the scent of salt and freedom, yet tinged with mystery. The city lights, far off on the horizon, seem so close you could almost touch them, a dazzling promise of a better future. But between you and this vision of hope stands an island. Alcatraz. A fortress of concrete and steel where dreams of freedom come to die. Its walls, built to withstand everything, have housed the most dangerous men, but also the most determined. The dark hallways still echo with the footsteps of prisoners and the barked orders of guards. Tonight, I will tell you one of the most fascinating stories from this place. A tale of courage, cunning, and defiance. An escape that left its mark on history forever. Imagine Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, men with troubled pasts but a clear goal: escape. Their story, filled with troubling details and unresolved mysteries, is a tribute to human perseverance. When the ferry approached Alcatraz, Frank Morris stared at the island's dark outline with cold determination. The icy, damp sea air seemed to seep under his skin, but he remained still, hands cuffed in front of him. A massive guard with a stern face and an impeccable uniform approached, sneering, not looking at the city. "Morris? It's the last time you'll see it this close." Frank didn't respond. He turned his gaze from the shimmering water to the concrete dock drawing nearer. The prison's imposing structure loomed before him, cold and intimidating. The group of prisoners disembarked in silence, each keeping their head down. The cries of seagulls pierced the air, but the men paid no attention. The metallic clinking of chains and the guards' bootsteps echoed like a somber prelude. Inside this unique prison, every wall and every corridor seemed designed to crush all hope. The cells, small and austere, contained only a metal bed, a rusty sink, and a bucket for necessities. The dull gray bars formed an impenetrable grid. The watchtowers, equipped with powerful spotlights and rifles, constantly monitored every movement. The icy waters surrounding the island acted as another barrier, discouraging any thoughts of escape. Frank observed all this intently. He didn't just see a prison, he saw a challenge. A few days after his arrival, Frank had already begun analyzing his new environment. Every detail mattered: the guards' patrols, the prisoners' routines, the dull clanging of gates opening and closing. In the exercise yard, a space framed by towering walls and watched over by armed guards, he sat on a worn bench, elbows on his knees. He observed the groups forming, the discreet conversations exchanged among inmates. That's when he noticed two men who always moved together, inseparable. John and Clarence Anglin. The brothers had a unique presence. John, tall and charismatic, spoke confidently, while Clarence, smaller, listened and nodded with a faint smile. John made the first move. He approached Frank with a sly grin and said, "You're new here, right?" Frank nodded without speaking. Clarence turned to his brother. Leave him alone, John. Not everyone here wants to chat. But John insisted. No, wait. This guy, he's thinking. Am I right? Frank slowly raised his eyes. And what are you doing besides asking pointless questions? John burst out laughing. I like this guy. I'm John, and this here is Clarence. Frank raised an eyebrow. Frank Morris. Over the next few days, the three men began talking more. Sitting at the same table in the mess hall, they shared fragments of their pasts, always cautiously. One evening, as the buzz of the dining hall subsided, John whispered, "So, Frank, what landed you here?" After a moment of silence, Frank replied in a detached tone, "Bank robbery." "And you?" John grinned. "Same here. Clarence and I had a good rhythm going. One bank here, another there. Until we got caught." Clarence, eyes downcast, added softly, "We didn't want to hurt anyone. It was just to survive." Frank nodded, respecting the sincerity in Clarence's words. He knew that behind every crime lay a complex story. One night, while lying in their respective cells, Frank murmured through the walls, "Have you noticed the ventilation grates?" John's voice, muffled but curious, responded, "What, the ones behind the bed?" "Yes. They're not as sturdy as they look. If we remove them, we could access the ducts." Clarence interjected, concerned, "And then what?" "Even if we get to a duct, we're still trapped." Frank smiled in the darkness. "Every wall has a weakness. If we find it, we can get out. But it'll take time." John laughed. "Well, I'm not in a rush. What's your plan, boss?" The next day, Frank spent an hour discreetly examining the vent behind his bed. It was fastened with rusty bolts and seemed slightly unstable. He also scrutinized the walls around it. The concrete was thick but crumbly in places. During lunch, he shared his observations with John and Clarence. "If we carefully scrape around the bolts each night, we could weaken the structure." Clarence, ever pragmatic, frowned. "With what?" "We don't have any tools." Frank replied calmly, "We improvise. Spoons, bits of metal, anything we can find." Every night, after the guards' final rounds, the three men got to work. Frank had stolen a spoon from the mess hall and discreetly fashioned it into a scraping tool. Lying on their beds, they worked slowly, synchronizing their movements with the ambient noises to mask the sound. "Go slower, Clarence," Frank whispered one night. "If you make too much noise, we're done for." Clarence grumbled. Easier said than done. John, in the neighboring cell, murmured with a smile, "Come on, little brother. Pretend you're digging a tunnel out of hell." Life in Alcatraz was harsh. Prisoners rose at dawn, ate bland meals, and repeated the same tasks every day. The guards, often brutal, didn't hesitate to punish even the slightest infraction. One day, during the yard break, Frank noticed an older prisoner sitting alone in a corner. He had bruises on his face and looked exhausted. What happened to him? Frank whispered to John. John shrugged. He talked to a guard like they were equals. Bad idea here. This observation only strengthened their resolve. For them, staying in Alcatraz meant the slow destruction of their humanity. After weeks of effort, the tunnels behind their vents were taking shape. But Frank knew their plan needed a diversion. He suggested making dummies to simulate their presence in the beds. "We'll need soap, hair, and old shirts," he explained. Clarence, who had a knack for crafting, volunteered to sculpt the heads. One night, he showed his first creation to his companions. John burst out laughing. "It almost looks like Frank, but nicer." Frank smiled. "As long as it fools the guards, I don't care." With the tunnels nearly complete and the dummies ready, one crucial element remained: a way to leave the island. Frank had thought long and hard about this problem. The idea of an inflatable raft took shape after he noticed a pile of old raincoats in the sewing workshop. One evening during dinner, he shared his idea with John and Clarence. "We'll sew the raincoats together to make a raft. Once inflated, it should carry us to shore." John frowned. "And how do you plan to inflate it? With our lungs?" Frank shrugged. "No. I saw an old vacuum cleaner in the workshop. With a bit of tinkering, we can turn it into a pump." Clarence, impressed, added, "It could work, but it'll take time. The guards won't let us play dress up all day." Frank replied calmly, "We'll work at night." Like always. The three men began working on the raft as soon as they obtained the raincoats. They carefully cut and sewed each piece, using stolen thread and needles hidden in their clothes. One night, while engrossed in their task, Clarence murmured, "Do you really think we can make it? That the sea won't swallow us?" Frank responded without looking up, "If we stay here, we're already dead." John, sitting beside him, placed a reassuring hand on his brother's shoulder. "And if the sea tries to swallow us, we'll give it a fight." Before the big day, they decided to test their raft. One night, they inflated a small section to check its watertightness. The workshop echoed with the faint hum of the modified vacuum cleaner they used to pump air into their creation. "It holds," Clarence murmured, pressing the fabric to check. Frank, focused, added, "We still need to reinforce the seams here and there." "But it's doable." John grinned. "We're going to float, guys. I can feel it." As the date approached, tension mounted. Every detail had to be perfect. Frank spent hours checking the tunnels, the dummies, and the raft. One evening, he gathered John and Clarence for a final briefing. "Listen carefully. The slightest mistake and we're done for. Stick to the plan. If one of us gets caught, the others keep going. John nodded, unusually serious. We know, Frank. But if we're here tonight, it's because we're ready. Clarence, nervous but determined, murmured, "And if the raft sinks?" Frank stared him in the eye. "Then we swim until our last breath." On June 11th, 1962, the night was icy. The howling winds around the rock seemed to warn against challenging the sea. In their cells, the three men carefully placed the dummies in their beds. The heads, lit by the dim glow of the guards' rounds, looked so realistic it was hard to tell them apart from real people. Frank gave a discreet signal to his companions. They crawled through the tunnels they had spent months digging, their hearts pounding. When they reached the prison roof, the icy wind hit them full force. Before them, the San Francisco Bay stretched out, dark and restless. But on the horizon, the city lights twinkled, a beacon guiding their hope. They rappelled down the exterior walls, using improvised ropes. The raft awaited them at the water's edge, carefully hidden under debris. Inflating the raft, though risky, went smoothly. The stitched fabric held firm, and the craft floated on the choppy water. "Get in," Frank murmured, pushing the raft. John and Clarence climbed aboard carefully, followed by Frank. They began paddling with pieces of wood they had carved in advance. The sea was freezing, and the waves threatened to capsize their craft. But Frank, always calm, directed their movements. "Keep the rhythm. Don't let up." By morning, Alcatraz was in turmoil. The guards, discovering the empty beds and the dummies, raised the alarm. Searches were launched across the bay, but no trace of the fugitives was found. The raft was discovered washed ashore on Angel Island, bearing signs of use. However, there was no trace of the men themselves. Theories about their fate abound. Some claimed they reached the shore and now live under assumed identities. Others believe they perished in the bay's icy waters. Let's imagine for a moment that Frank, John, and Clarence succeeded. After reaching land, they would have had to split up to avoid detection. Frank, methodical, might have found refuge in a small town, living quietly as a laborer or farmer. John, with his natural charisma, could have blended into a community by spinning a fabricated story. Clarence, ever pragmatic, would have followed his brother's lead, but from a distance. Their silence would be their greatest weapon. A quiet life, far from prying eyes, would be their only chance to preserve their freedom